Hi, I'm Rory. Welcome again to 2022's XR Summit. In this session, we are exploring what digital identity means for your business. Today, I'm joined by Roman Rappak, the CCO and co-founder of Ristband, as well as the CEO of Geenee AR, Rory, and we are also joined by Geenee AR's VP of Partner Development, Elena De Sosa. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for having us.
Brilliant, thank you all so much. So let's start off by defining who needs a metaverse platform and why should businesses take their Web3 digital identity seriously. Roman, do you mind kicking us off for this?
Yeah, I guess there's a really amazing interview with, I can't remember, Sun Microsystems in 1995, where he says by 2000 every business will need to be on the internet, and it was one of those things that kind of shocked a lot of people, thinking how could this clunky thing that doesn't work very well, that's really expensive, which is the sort of early 90s internet, how can that be something that every business will be on? How would they be able to afford it, and also who's going to visit these sites? And then which is a really prescient comment, and kind of there's so many parallels between sort of 1992 internet and 2022 metaverse predictions and assumptions and misconceptions. But the other thing he says at the following part of that interview, and it's usually that bit that's used a lot, and especially at the moment in lots of clips about the metaverse, is he says it's going to replace the yellow pages as we know it today. So it's like, and that's, I think, a really good example of how important it is, how like ill-conceived it is at the moment, and how we can't possibly predict exactly what it's going to be, but we can have assumptions about it. So if you think that every business is now, pretty much every business is on the internet, and most businesses are, I think it's 20% of the economy takes place of consumer economy takes place on the internet. If you are a shop and you don't have a website, then you're not a very good shop. And I think with the metaverse, if you think of it as being the spatial internet, every experience is enhanced by the idea of using 3D space, by the idea of it being a spatial experience. So I think how important it is incredibly important for any business, any brand, any artist, because the strange kind of contradiction is that by using all this more and more increasingly complex and futuristic technology, we sort of go back to what human beings are really good at. We're mammals that were built to operate in three-dimensional worlds. 2D, reading a book or looking at a picture or watching a screen is kind of an abstraction of reality. So I think it's an interesting contrast between being in a surreal, abstract world that isn't real is somehow more real than staring at it through our screens.
It's a good point. Rory, Elena, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with what Roman stated, and we're not the only ones. McKinsey Consulting said that the metaverse, in terms of economic value, will number $5 trillion by 2030. So that's a momentous shift of purchasing behavior and the way that people interact with brands. The opportunity with technologies like Ristband, like Geenee, is that you don't need to think on a two-dimensional plane. You either can overlay the digital goods, experiences, storefronts, assets over any physical environment on the go, or you can enter a virtual world, in the case of Ristband, and experience live events, concerts, music, so forth. And we see a multiverse of different worlds being developed, brands embracing this at a clip that we haven't seen since the late 90s of the adoption of URLs on websites. So it's the history of this is being written today in real time, and the tools, the infrastructure, the creator platforms are really set to change the behavior of commerce and in branded relationships in a spatial way.
Elena, have any thoughts from you about the idea of digital identity for your business?
What's really interesting is I come from a media agency background, and one issue in terms of getting your message out to your audience is the walled gardens, which is really something that is a product of Web 2. And the promise of Web 3, which is really exciting, is that you'll be able to continue the conversation across platforms and continue that identity and talk to that same audience, but in such a more customized way and a personal way. And so you're really going to be able to deepen that relationship that you have with your audience. And it opens up whole new monetization avenues as well. When you're talking about digital goods, how that can relate to a brand, what that brand presence looks like in the metaverse. So it's a huge opportunity for brands, and it's one that they've really been hungry for a long time. When I was working with some clients in the past, it was like, well, if we're advertising on Twitch and we're advertising on Facebook, we don't know if there's a lot of duplicate in this audience. We can just kind of guess. But now there's going to be a new way to connect. And I think that's really exciting for brands. And that's definitely something to consider in terms of why it's important to start forming your metaverse strategy early and now and start experimenting. And that's what's really cool about being on the ground floor of building these sorts of technologies.
Brilliant. I like how you brought up connectivity. That flows right into my next point about how important is it, how important is it to consider inoperability when distributing bespoke immersive content? Corey, how do you feel about this? And do you mind kicking us off?
Yeah, that's interoperability is at the core of what we do at Geenee. That is web-based augmented reality. So traditionally, the developers of advanced AR tools like Spark AR, Lens Studio, now TikTok, AR Effects Studio, you have to download the app. You have to be in that ecosystem. Oftentimes, you have to give up some type of revenue share if you have a good. And if you're making an app yourself independently, you have to go through one of just a few app stores, which are going to take oftentimes a 30% revenue share. And so if the ethos of and the promise of Web3 technologies, which include some of the imminent capabilities, which are going to be AR and VR, the experiential layer and the spatial layer, but the ability, not just of the technology, it's as much of a cultural shift, and it's a reaction to consumers and in some cases brands who want more freedom and control, who want verifiable ownership of their works, oftentimes from a creator standpoint. And when you have to go through a single door to gain entry or access, that is actually at odds with the ethos and the spirit of Web3 technologies and blockchain capabilities. So with web-based augmented reality, web AR, there is no gate, there's no app store review, and once you're done with the experience, you're also not being tracked anywhere. So the security and privacy of the experience is guaranteed when it ends, when you're done accessing it. And so there really isn't a more decentralized technology in terms of a spatial context than being web-based. There are about 5-6 billion browser-based connected mobile devices. All desktops primarily are connected to the web, and all you need is a monocular single camera, not a stereo vision camera, to be able to experience and oftentimes create, publish, and share augmented reality, and that can be connected to the blockchain through web AR.
Brilliant, Elena. Could you expand upon this at all from Geenee AR's perspective before we move over to Roman?
Yes. So the opportunity is both from a creator tool standpoint and also from an infrastructure. And what we're really excited about is templatizing NFT-based games, multiplayer games that can be highly scalable. You can drop in your NFT character asset, oftentimes without needing to do any rigging or animation, because so much of what has been built over the past years are a lot of great assets. Some are from virtual worlds like the Sandbox, which if you actually buy that asset online, it comes pre-rigged. We see Ready Player Me, Konex has just released their models, which are GLTF, GLB, and then those are metaverse ready assets, which means that you can take that into AR, you can take it into VR, I'm sure, in the Ristband. You can use it in games, and that's at the heart of interoperability and access. So with web-based augmented reality, you can tap a link or scan a code. We believe every non-fungible token should have a QR code, and QR code is for quick response, but it probably should be called an XR code these days, because it's really about extending that reality with a scan or a click. And it takes about 5.5 seconds to launch an experience and engage and be in a community, hang out with your friends in a collaborative environment. And trying to download an app, depending on the weight size of it, which could be hundreds of megabytes, you're going to have a huge churn rate for a brand. And for kind of these digestible experiences on the go, it doesn't make sense to have that friction. So it's all about increasing access, convenience, lowering the barriers to create, and bringing people together in a new spatial way, but also a way that can encourage digital ownership. And that opens up a huge opportunity for artists. We're working with an artist named Isabel Lago, who's been painting gorillas long before Bored Apes for about a decade and a half. She has a fine art degree from UC Santa Cruz. And we've just been able to take those gorillas as 3D avatars and play them in a game alongside other NFTs, content like cyberpunks and so forth. So that's really the opportunity for maybe undiscovered people with extreme degrees of talent to market their goods and do it themselves without having to go through a single door that's going to take 30%.
And I'll just add to what Corey's saying, because I agree with all of that, and that's what's really exciting. But it gives the user and the creator, just from a digital identity perspective, the chance to really reinvent the user profile into something that really is tangible and feels like a personality rather than just a form that you fill out for each different social profile, depending on how you want to talk to your audience on each page. And that just makes it so much more fun, because you're getting to decide what your avatar looks like, what they wear, how they present themselves. And it's just opening up all of these new doors. And I think that's one of the things that's so exciting, just from the basic user perspective from the metaverse, and is everything that you think through on a daily basis when you're getting dressed, you can think through with your avatar, depending on how you want them to present, if it's a work situation, if it's a social situation. And so there's going to be a lot of those pieces to think through. And the avatar is something that we've really been focusing on at Geenee, and taking that same avatar from, like Corey was saying, from different virtual environments into web AR, and what that means and what that looks like, and just trying to come up with the most seamless way to bring that avatar into the web AR space from where it originally existed. So we're doing a lot of work on that. And one reason is because we're the only web AR technology currently that has full body tracking for the browser. So users can wear their avatar, they can become their avatar in augmented reality. They can also dance with their avatar and have the movements mimic their own. They can use their own gestures to move digital objects. So we're just starting to scratch the surface there, but that's something that's personally really exciting to me, and I think it's going to be really exciting for a lot of creators.
Roman, I didn't know if you had any thoughts to share on that last piece before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, I did. There was some really interesting bits in that, and the two bits that really stood out is that this idea of first of all, creating the idea of interoperability being web-based. So the idea of using what people think of as a 25-year-old technology, right? The browser's an old piece of technology, and the sort of reflex reaction is to think, oh, it's all going to be different, and we're all going to be wandering around with AR glasses, and it's all going to be. But actually, what we've done a kind of similarity with Geenee and with Ristband, we received an Epic mega grant, and we were able to kind of really explore how pixel streaming worked. So it's, for people who don't know, it's a similar thing to making it web-based in the kind of very simple terms. It means that the game is running in the cloud and streamed like Netflix is streamed to your laptop. That means that you don't need a high-powered PC. It means it runs on your mum's iPad. It runs on anything. And what we found was the barrier for entry being lower meant that people who wouldn't even identify as people who play games or are interested in the metaverse were jumping into it. And because it's in that way of it being a browser and it's a world that you jump into, it kind of really ties in with this idea of not thinking of the metaverse as it's going to replace the internet. It's an extension and a progression of it. And I think that using those same analogies, again, going back to the early 90s internet, it's like this mass of different protocols of standards. So it wasn't like a company came up with something. You have these people have to come up with Netscape. These people come up with like the JPEG. And everyone comes up with these different things. And then there's an entire process of standardization and people working so that when you jump on a website now, you're not saying, it's not like you can't go onto a website because that's an AOL website, or you can't load that JPEG because it's this one and your computer only needs that. And I think that there's something that we're really aware of, is there's going to be this process where we will have to, the kind of almost like a survival of the fittest of what functionality is the best for everyone. And I think like companies like Geenee are a good example of that it's focusing on what does the user want from a user experience. Like, it has to be engaging, it has to be fun. It can't be 90 different pages of things you have to upload and 12 things you have to download. And I think that's why these, that's what companies find success a lot quicker, because it's a usable thing. It's not like a deep kind of tech thing that you get into. And the other part I was thinking about interoperability and kind of this idea that we're jumping from experience to experience is a lot of the excitement to do with the metaverse particularly is probably, I personally feel it's because companies who traditionally had nothing to do with the gaming industry or the tech industry have, well, quite rightly, looked at the 2.8 billion people that play video games that originally weren't invited to that party. And suddenly they're saying, hey, I'm Balenciaga, but I can have a game, or I'm a Universal Records and I can do a show in Roblox. And I think that there's an entire gaming culture and approach to how games work, which is actually a really complex science. It's not, you can't just throw someone into a world. You have to understand the things that Rory was mentioning, which is like the psychology of how the user experience works, or what Elena was saying, which is quite a kind of psychological reaction to yourself and who you are and how you prepare and what your day is and your identity. So I think that's those are going to be the building blocks for it actually being interoperable.
Fantastic. There's so much great food for thought there. I'm going to have to wrap this up with a final question, though. So I'd just like to put it out there. I'd like to ask, what are your predictions for the future of, and then the role we as people inside the XR industry play in digital inclusivity and representation? Elena, would you like to start us off before we perhaps move over to Roman for some final words?
I think there are so many possibilities for what the metaverse can be in the future. We've all read Snow Crash and Ready Player One, and even though those are some more apocalyptic descriptions of what it could be, I think it's also very exciting because it's clearly inspired a whole industry to pop up and create these amazing experiences, or at least the beginnings of them. And I think we can all see the promise of it. And one piece of that that's super important is making sure that there's enough opportunity for everyone who, if we're thinking that the future audience of the metaverse is everyone, it's really important that everyone is able to be part in building and defining what it becomes. And I think that starts with core teams from the different companies that are taking the lead on creating metaverse technologies, and making sure that there are different perspectives from the team members who are coming up with the ideas and the experiences, and also that you're getting that user feedback, and that it's feedback that's coming from different audiences. So definitely something to keep in mind from an inclusivity perspective. And one other anecdote that I heard recently that I thought was super interesting, I was at an AR House event last night, and one of the founders of AR House, Lucas, mentioned that he's from Brazil. And in Brazil, Oculus headsets are $2,000, which is so much more expensive than they are here. But in addition to that, that's like an entire year's salary for someone. And so if you're a creator and you want to be involved in shaping the metaverse, but you're from Brazil or you're located in Brazil, it's really difficult to gain access to the hardware that lets you enter into these experiences and really build for them so you can understand what it looks like. And by the time you're finally able to even like save up for one, the technology will have moved on. So I think while the metaverse is awesome, because in a way it really is like social media did, it's breaking down barriers and giving more people the ability to connect from far away without having to buy a plane ticket or pay for an expensive hotel room. There are also certain barriers that are in gates that are keeping people out. And so I think when we are creating this place where we're all surely going to be spending a lot of time in the future, we should keep that in mind and just be really conscientious of it. And I know that Ristband and Roman have been putting out a lot of content that really considers this in terms of inclusivity and diversity. So I'd love to also hear from him what he thinks, but that's just something that I think we should all keep in mind as we're building it. And we can really create that sort of digital twin world, and it's up to us to define what that looks like.
Well, building upon what Elena said, is there are actual a lot of VR solutions like Tailspin, which creates diversity and inclusion training and role playing for corporations to be on the other side of feeling in a virtual way the experience of being at times of being a minority or being discriminated against in a way that you can do virtually and not in either in a real setting, which would be very hurtful, but in a way that you could get kind of a digital virtual form of empathy in that scenario. But I think that one of the promises of Web3, the internet, spatial computing, is to be who you want to be without maybe asking for permission. We see a lot of regulation that's actually regulating how people can express themselves and how they can be with the partner that they choose or be the gender that they choose. And in a virtual setting, they're actually oftentimes you may have more freedom in some of these spaces. Now, sometimes that may be too much. We see that be abused or where there's harmful elements, and I think platforms should be responsible for regulating some of those negative elements of unfettered freedom and expression. But for the most part, we see virtually people. There's a lot of platforms like Zepeto you can go into, and oftentimes people are role playing as different genders, on that, and I think that's accepted there. It's very open. But what I would emphasize is that when we talk about equality and inclusion, I think that the platforms that are building these virtual worlds, whether it's AR, VR, should actually be inclusive in organizationally, starting at the board level, at the executive level. And it's something that Geenee and I know from experience, Ristband's co-founder Ann McKinnon also is it's not, Ristband is not all men. Geenee is not all men. Elena's an executive. Our VP of finance is Nancy, and our head of creative design is Heather. And so we're trying to balance it where we see so many tech companies that are not that diverse and maybe not that inclusive of different genders, of different orientation, of different minorities and so forth. So I think that it starts with the actual DNA of the company to put that into the virtual worlds and products that they build.
Yeah, I can agree more with all that. I think also, I mean, this is obviously Anne is our CEO, and it's interesting working alongside someone who works in tech and who's a woman and who's worked as an intern in one place and as a journalist in another place, because you don't really get that perspective unless you are working alongside someone. You kind of see it from far. And I think that if like the tech culture, if you say the word tech culture to most people, it has all these horrendous like kind of Uber and like harassment and big business and all these negative connotations. And the same with the gaming industry. And one thing that I heard, which actually I found really heartwarming about the approach that the XR is taking, is this argument that we look at movies and we look at video games, the two biggest entertainment mediums, and they're so dominated by masculine elements of violence, of anger, and one argument is well, all of these industries started off mostly dominated by men. So naturally, the way that they would objectify a woman, the way they would look at violence, they would handle those kind of subject matter would be geared towards that. And so we end up with these products like video games are, majority of them when they were first starting out, quite straightforward because they were quite binary. So killing something and shooting something and jumping on something is pretty straightforward. Whereas now games are so sophisticated, you can have narrative and you can have subtleties and nuances that you couldn't really have before. And the thing that I found really heartwarming was when the first time I ever went to the US after we started the project where we were doing VR shows, live music VR shows. I went to the US for, it was VRLA. And I kind of was expecting that cliche of tech bro culture and the business thing and, loads of sort of VCs sort of fighting over something. And I was so amazed to find that actually there was this incredible positive hippie culture thing, which actually, when you start to look into it, you can really trace Silicon Valley back to Atari and Nolan Bushnell and like San Francisco counterculture. It's effectively a hippie movement that became so enormous that obviously business kind of pollutes it. Then we get Web 2, which there's another argument that Web 2 has been this gross misstep. So we can't think of internet is bad, computers are bad. It's exactly what Elena said at the beginning, that this idea of clicks equals sponsors and sell your data and all that, that's actually nothing to do with the original optimistic view of what the internet was supposed to be. And I think the most exciting thing for me is it kind of feels like it's our second chance at it, or maybe our fourth chance at it. And I think with these new tools and with these new people working on it, and the fact that it is a much more diverse scene, if you think about if you compare it to like the video game scene, or if you compare it to definitely the music industry. And so I think we've got a really good chance of making something important and realizing this quite optimistic. I realize I sound like a bit of a hippie, but I just think that's the thing that I find really, really exciting.
I think we're all just really excited about the potential and the chance to shape and mold something. And that's really where we are, is sort of like that entry level place where the metaverse gets to be defined. So it's just very cool to be part of that.
And I've never lived through a moment like this. Like you hear from your parents or from your grandparents, oh, this time was an incredible period. And if you'd have been around, or when punk happened, everything changed, or when this happened, or rave culture, and I always felt, well, where's our moment? Where's our moment going to come from? So this feels like it. Just with better graphics.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant. I really appreciate the optimistic and obviously the hippie outlook. But I'd like to wrap that all up. There's been a ton of valuable insight there just in the last question alone. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me today, because that's all we have time for. That was all incredibly valuable. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you, Rory.
Good to see you, Corey. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Good to
See
see
you,
you,
Roman.
Roman.
Cool. Thanks very much, guys. I'm Rory Greener from XR Today. Get more XR news by following our social pages and follow the event's hashtag. Thank you very much for watching.